majority Black South Africa is not immune to systemic racism or bias. Police brutality is an example of this. More than 5,500 cases of police criminal offences are reported every year. Since the financial year 2014-15 to 2017-18, only 1.9% of police were convicted, at a conviction rate of lower than 2.5% per year. The conviction rate for torture is 0. Our Constitution reminds the police that everyone has the right to security, free from all forms of violence, free from being tortured in any way, and not to be treated in a cruel, inhumane, and degrading way. Most of the victims are people from Black and brown communities. During the lockdown of 2020, there was a concentrated military and police presence in these communities, often resulting in acts of illegal and forceful evictions, violence, and even death. I am privileged. I live in the suburbs with a majority white community. Not once had I witnessed police or military presence during the lockdown, and none of my neighbors died at the hands of the police or the military. How can we create a free and fair South Africa? How can we contribute to ensure that there is social justice and accountability for these types of abuses? Hi, I'm Marissa Manech, and you're listening to the Woven Experiences podcast. Here we share stories around important topics and explore the interconnectedness between ourselves and the world around us. Let's get into it. Today's guest is Lovelyn Nwadeyi. She is the director at L&N Advisors, a consulting firm committed to embedding social justice in the daily practices of organizations. Lovelyn works as a social equity and social justice consultant across academic, corporate, and religious spaces. Welcome to the Woven Experiences podcast. Thank you so much for joining us. Lovelyn, could you tell my listeners a little bit more about who you are and what you do?
So professionally, I like to think of myself as a social justice practitioner. So the work that I do would be taking place in schools, in corporates, as well as in faith communities. From a quantity perspective, the majority of my work does come from the educational institutions. And in those institutions, the work that we're doing is helping them navigate matters of social justice and identity. The one piece of that work is the education piece, so getting people to unlearn, relearn, and just expose themselves to views and perspectives that typically they might not have been exposed to. But beyond that, it's also helping schools especially, but corporates as well, to think about designing policies, designing their institutional frameworks differently in such a way that those frameworks actually have social justice at their center. So in the South African context, you cannot talk about social justice without talking about race or gender or sexuality or class or ability. So all those aspects of identity come into play when we are having these types of conversations and engagements. And then hopefully as part of the process of, designing policy and designing for institutional changes, part of that process is then accompanying senior leaders and working with senior leaders through a coaching process to support them as well on their own personal journeys through anti-racism, anti-sexism, etc., etc. So in a nutshell, that's the work that I do.
Okay, great. In many of your interviews, you say this is your calling. Where did it start? What ignited that flame?
It's interesting you asked that question. So yeah, I do see the work that I do as a calling. I don't think one can consciously choose to expose yourself to the amount of frustrating conversations and sometimes even quite emotionally violent interactions that I have. I don't think one can choose to expose yourself to that, because this work can be very draining and very exhausting. So why I speak about it as a calling is because I think that it takes a lot for us to rebuild the bridges that have been burned between us. I think all systems of oppression were put in place to disrupt our connection as human beings, and so at a human level, there's so much that we're missing out on from each other. And in order to rewire our relationships and rewire our interactions, but also rewire our own hearts and minds, in order to do that, there's a way in which we need people who can hold space for that to happen, and that's part of that. This calling. I can't honestly pinpoint the exact date and time when it happened. What I do know is, and it's funny, I've had this conversation with one of my primary school teachers, but I do know that from a young age, I've always been deeply moved by any sense of injustice or unfairness. I've always been sort of arguing and fighting and debating and just fighting for the underdog, if I can put it that way. um, but yeah, I think from a young age, I always just had a sense of, if something is not okay, it's not okay, and we can't just let it slide. But I guess if I can think of my own sort of adult life, I do think that. So obviously, I think my time when I was studying at Stellenbosch definitely just was quite a interesting experience that in many ways was also quite disruptive for me. Just being in a racial minority at Stellenbosch University, and having to be involved in quite a lot of platforms at the university that were trying to address some of these difficulties in experience. But even at that time, I don't think it was that. I mean, I think we did something, but I think coming to 2015, I think Roads Must Fall, Open Stellenbosch, and the Fees Must Fall movement definitely were a very clear turning point for me in terms of my own activism, my own politics, and my relationship to matters of liberation. So I think whilst I've always had this sort of deep moral conviction about right and wrong, I think definitely from 2015, um, there was definitely some sort of a flame and a fire that was ignited, and yeah, I would be dishonest not to credit that to the Roads Must Fall, the Open Stellenbosch, and Fees Must Fall movements of 2015.
I would like to talk about the current systems in our society that work against people of color. As a country with a dominantly black government, it's hard to understand how this is still possible. A recent example was the police and military abusing their power by conducting illegal evictions during the COVID lockdown, and the physical brutality that cost the lives of Colin Koza, Sibusiso Amos, Petrus Michels, and Adain Emmanuel. It's been getting a lot of attention now, but these systems have always existed.
Yeah,
Why is that?
yeah. There's a lot in that question. Yeah, so I mean, I think definitely the kind of state-sanctioned violence that we see in our country is not. It's not new. It's something that's part of our country and our history. I do think living in an age of social media, of smartphones, where everybody, in a sense, is a citizen journalist or can be a citizen journalist if they want to. I think that just that already broadens people's access to certain information, but also there's a real time to it. Like, as something is happening in real time, I can broadcast it live on Facebook or Twitter or Instagram or whatever it is. So I think technology has a huge part to be credited for, in a sense, for how visible these things are. And also just there isn't too much space between when something happens and when it's reported to maybe manipulate or change the story or doctor the story as much. So definitely think technology has played a role there. But I think that there is a bigger question we need to ask. So I mean, whilst absolutely I accept that South Africa in 2020 is a country that is being run by a black government, I do think that we would be dishonest to assume that black people are somehow above the standards of we would be dishonest to assume that black people for some reason would not be prone to the same ills and the same evils that any other group of human beings might be prone to. And I think this is where we get quite dishonest in our narratives about race and identity in South Africa. So for me, the first step is to just talk about state-sanctioned violence, which is built into the DNA of this country. There has never been a time in our history where the government has ever served the majority of people in this country, right? So there has never been a time where political authority in this country has ever been mobilized in favor of the majority of people. So whether you are talking about, 1652, Jan van Riebeeck, colonial government, whether you're talking 1820, arrival of British settlers, even though none of those were ever legitimate governments, as it were, just that political formation of government was never deployed to look after or to protect the interests of the majority of people in this country. So the history that we have as South Africans is a history of violence. It is a history of state-sanctioned violence. And the only difference now is that it just so happens that the state, as it were, might have a numerical racial majority, but the state hasn't changed in terms of its own psychological orientation towards the people, right? So when I think about things like apartheid, the apartheid regime was a white government that directed itself towards focusing on a minority of people in order to protect them, provide them with jobs, etc., etc. And all of that, whether we want to accept it or not, is really just a form of corruption, right? If we talk about corruption, corruption is just greed, right? It's stealing from many to look after a few. So if I want to be generous, on its best day, apartheid was a form of corruption. And part of that corruption was to say, if we are going to use state resources, we are going to use them very intentionally to disempower the majority of people in this country and to empower a minority of people. That same tradition has continued. The difference for us is that the impact of racializing state-sanctioned violence is that doesn't stop because you've got a black government, right? It doesn't stop because you have a black government. In fact, all that happened was we replaced a white emperor with a black emperor. But the institutional memory that we have is an institutional memory of violence, and that violence has always been targeted specifically at black and brown bodies in this country. And so as a result, even if you do have a black government, the reality is that if they've internalized the same logic that we can steal from many to look after a few, then the logic of the institutions don't change, right? The logic of the political bureaucracy doesn't change just because you've changed the face of that political bureaucracy. And so the result is that you still have a system that perpetuates the same behavior, but we struggle to read it and make sense of it because for some reason we hold black people to a higher moral standard, as if black people aren't human beings either. So in many ways, actually, the expectation that a black government should be better than a white government is a dehumanizing expectation, because then we are assuming that because they're black, they won't be subject to greed, which is a natural. Well, I don't want to say it's natural, but I think that all human beings can be tempted by greed and the opportunity to amass wealth. And so when I think about police violence in South Africa, I think because the logic of violence in South Africa is inherently a racialized logic of violence. So we don't have a time in our history where there was systematic targeted violence against white people, for example, in such a way that had systemic and structural implications. And so because the logic of violence in our country is highly racialized and skewed towards black people, it means that even when you have a democratic political system, unless you have done the psychological and the social, so the psychosocial work that's required to undo that normalizing of racialized violence, unless you do that psychological and social work, all you're going to do is just perpetuate the same systems that have always been there. And this is what we talk about when we talk about internalized oppression, right? So the internalized oppression basically speaks to what happens when people who have been marginalized or oppressed by a certain system start to internalize those lies for themselves and enact that onto others. So that we have a majority black police force is not it's not a special achievement. If that police force has grown up in a country with where the messaging that they've been receiving is that black people are worthless and black people are more deserving of violence or should be more subject to violence, or that black communities are inherently criminal and as a result deserve more policing. If you've grown up in a society where that's the regular messaging you're getting, or that black people are inherently criminal, when you become a police officer, you're not becoming a black police officer. You're a police officer who's internalized the messages from your society. And so those are going to translate into certain actions. And your actions are informed by this bias that you've developed about whose bodies are more policeable, whose bodies are more violatable. And unfortunately, in the South African context, the bodies that are more policeable and more violatable are the bodies of black and brown people. And that's how that kind of logic embeds itself in an institution, such that even the people in it are often victims of that logic themselves, and will enact that onto others. So, I mean, I was in lockdown as well in this country. I live in a suburb in Johannesburg. I never once encountered the military. Not once. Not a single once. And I know people in my neighborhood were going out and about during lockdown. Not everybody was complying. I know that people were careless about wearing masks in my nice suburb, but there was not once that I encountered the military in my suburb. Why is it that townships required the military in order to implement the lockdown? And how disgusting and dehumanizing is it for us to assume that black and colored poor people should be more policed, and in fact policed through the military, so that those communities needed to be more militarized than communities in the suburbs? If anybody had the means to rebel against lockdown regulations, it's those of us who are middle class and in the suburbs. We could actually afford to get away with our misdemeanors during the lockdown. People in the townships don't and can't. And then it tells you something. Sorry, now I'm going on forever, but just my last point.
No, go for
it
it.
also tells you something about how dishonest we are as a country about the lived realities of people. It's very easy to social distance when you live in a 4-bedroomed house and there's only 4 of you. It's very hard to social distance when you live in a 1-bedroom shack and 8 of you are there in that same, sharing that same space, right? And the fact that our government, it made sense to them that we must send the military to go and police people who are living on top of each other, and physically could not social distance. The fact that our government thought that makes sense just speaks to the ahistorical and acontextual planning that happens in this country, and then also the freedom that middle class South Africans felt to further criticize what was happening in the townships. So I think there's a way in which the logic of domination doesn't just disappear because you've got a black government. I think in many ways, actually, many of us have internalized white norms and white standards, and are holding white supremacy actually as the standard to which everybody should be compared.
So, if institutions are that corrupt in itself, how or what changes? I mean, I would say changes on a governmental level, but if the government institution itself is corrupt, what type of changes need to take place so that there are institutions and systems that benefit everyone?
Yeah. So for me, the first thing is to note that systems are not made up of fairies. Systems are made up of human beings. Institutions are made up of people and human beings. So you actually cannot divorce systems from the people who are part of them. And as a result, if you're talking about doing meaningful, transformational, and not transformation in the black-white way, if you're trying to really change an institution, part of it for me is that you've got to change the people that are there. And I say this a lot, and people think I'm being ridiculous. I honestly think one of the biggest mistakes that we made in the negotiations of the 90s is that we didn't actually put mental health and psychological health at the center of the creation of the new South Africa. I honestly think that every single person that became a member of parliament in 1994 needed to have been sent for deep, long, ongoing therapy. Because the people who took over at a government level were people who either were fighting sort of in MK or were in the townships, organizing and, setting up marches and protests, or they were people who had been on the receiving end of systemic trauma for generations. These were not people who were well, right? And I don't mean that in a disrespectful way. I'm sure that, logically they had really great ideas about where the country needed to go. I believe that their hearts were absolutely in the right place. I have no question about their intentions, but I honestly think that we underestimated the damage that was done to us as a country on a psychic level that required a psychological intervention. So on the one hand, there are the Black, the colored, the Indian leaders of the anti-apartheid struggle who had been subject to years of violence, years of oppression, years of living on the edge. That does something to you as a human being. And then on the other end, you've got a percentage of parliament who are from the old government. These are people who for years had been told you are superior, you are better than, you are most important, you are entitled. South Africa only belongs to you. You deserve this, you deserve that. These are people who have also been subject to generations of conditioning around white supremacy. How on earth did we think that these two groups of people would have been able to successfully meaningfully change, and lead this country out of the mess that it was in? So I really think that what we missed out on was actually not just seeing these systems as systems that would work independent of people. Systems require people to work, which means you've got to work on those people. So I think that a lot of the white leaders needed to have undergone severe psychological treatment for the narcissism that comes with white supremacy, for the lack of empathy that comes with white supremacy, for the lack of, I don't want to call it awareness, because I don't think at that level the matter was ignorance, but I think the ways in which apartheid and colonialism in many ways has stripped white people in this country of their own sense of humanity. And so as a result, all you had was people who had internalized messages of superiority and would have stayed committed to implementing that regardless of the united government. And I think there was deep psychological and mental work that needed to happen there. And similarly, that work that needed to happen for the Black, colored, and Indian leaders who are going to come in at that level. And I think it's only when you dedicate sufficient resources to shifting people's minds and being honest about their experiences of trauma, and I think trauma on both sides. So I think that whilst many white people might not be aware of it, I think white people carry a lot of racial trauma that they don't even know they have. So I think that focusing on undoing and recovering from that trauma would have led us to having a much more empathetic political system, a much more equitable and just legal system and legal structure. And by modeling that to a country that was so young at the time, I think would have made it normal for us as a country to be more honest about the impact of racism at a family level, at a social, at a community level, etc., etc.
Yeah, the only way we can really change the system is if we change it on a social level. And that only happens if we as individuals transform and impact our communities. But this does take time. What steps can we take in the meantime? For example, in the States, they've called for defunding, reforming, and even abolishing the policing system. Is this the direction that we should take? What steps can the government take towards the social change necessary?
Yeah, you see, for me, the thing is, and unfortunately, I am a cynic when it comes to that. So I think the whole concept of the state is deeply problematic for me. Um, and I don't have the most creative solutions right now, but I think that it's very hard for me to see the state as in that political actor that has a monopoly on the means of violence. I struggle with putting my faith in the state for any meaningful transformation in society. And so I honestly I don't even know that I can say hand on heart that I really believe that the state is the answer. Um,
Mm,
what I will say is that I think that there have been ways in which and in small ways, we've seen this, but I think there are ways in which communities themselves can take charge and take responsibility for what's happening in their environment. And sometimes this has been done successfully in partnership with, local police. Um, but I think it's really difficult in a country like South Africa where many people don't even trust the police, especially black and brown communities in this country. I don't think a lot of us trust the police because of their historical institutional role. But I think that there are ways in which people can take charge of that. So whether it's things like again, so the solution for me is not, it's not a political solution, it's a social solution. Part of
mm,
what plagues our communities is things around, so obviously unemployment is a huge contributor to this, and where there's unemployment, where there's lack of access to resources, that translates into all the social ills that we see, whether it is
mm,
sexual violence, whether it's domestic violence, whether it is crime, right? All of those things are by their nature social problems that require social solution. So things like, so if I just take an example, I think of what it means to be a single mother in this country with a little child, and you are a cashier who works at Checkers, for example, right? So the
mm,
chances are you're earning very little, probably 400 times less than your CEO. So you're earning very little. You have no support in terms of childcare unless it's an older grandmother who's then probably also unemployed. So that just increases your bills at the end of the month. And if you don't have a granny who can look after your child, then you have to rely on neighbors or schools or aftercare programs within your area. In order for those kinds of programs to be successful, part of what you're going to need are safe public spaces, right? So after school parks, safe public spaces where kids can play, or public libraries where kids can go and sit and read. So they're not needing a lot of supervision in terms of like one-on-one attention, but they are in a safe public space where there are adults who are still able to keep an eye on them. You might
mm,
need things like, community parks that have uh, open sports facilities. You might need, spaces like public toilets, public water taps, and all of those things are things that, because of the spatial design of apartheid, our townships just do not have, right? And so what happens is
mm,
when kids hit puberty and they are idle or they are struggling financially and they are in need, there are certain social ills that just do become the most reasonable solution, right? So whether it becomes getting involved in drugs or crime or petty theft, things like that, all of that is as a result of the failure of the social structures that are in place in many suburbs, which were formerly white in this country, that make it easier to manage some of those challenges, right? So if a community doesn't have all those things in place, then by definition, you are creating the conditions under which crime will be higher, and therefore you require more policing. So I think part of it is we need to go back to the root. We need to go right back to the root of the issue in thinking through what the possible solutions might be. And then I think the other part is when you talk about things like spatial planning, part of it is that South African communities are so segregated, right? So you've got like maybe I don't want to quote sort of false statistics, but maybe you've got a small percentage of Black people who can now live in suburbs, who have managed to access the middle class, right? So those of us who live in suburbs are nice and comfortable. But for the most part, suburbs in South Africa are still majority, are very white. And so we live very segregated. You can still find only Black communities, only colored communities, only Indian communities, only white communities. And so living such segregated lives actually adds to the ways in which communities start to fear each other, come up with stories about each other that are often based on ignorance or just false facts. And that translates into the kind of animosity that you see. And so for me, I really think that South Africa needs to start considering things like uh, what you call it, mixed housing, so social housing that's mixed into suburbs. So, I mean, I can't speak for other parts of the country, but in Johannesburg and Cape Town, Stellenbosch, I mean, developments are going up every second day. And all of those developments that I see regularly are developments that are often luxury in nature, are not affordable to the average South African. And so for me, it's actually starting to implement the kind of legislation that forces construction companies, if you're going to build, a 26-story building of luxury apartments, that at least X percentage of those apartments must be ring fenced for affordable housing, right? So part of creating healthy social spaces is creating mixed social spaces. So where people who might not be financially wealthy get subsidies wherever, from the state, from the companies. I don't really care where the subsidies come from, but get subsidies to be able to live within those same buildings, within those same complexes, as a way of building social cohesion, so that we don't just have these islands of luxury and comfort in one part of the country and then have these seas of discomfort and violence and lack of services, etc. So we are going to have to finding ways of ensuring that people are engaging and engaging in ways that are dignified, right? So it's also not enough that white people get to go on buses and visit the township and look out the window from the high luxury bus and observe the Black people in their native habitat. Part of it is actually also saying that if we really believe in justice for this country, then we need to start creating spaces where the rich and the poor, which unfortunately in our country, race is still very much determinant for class. We have to start creating spaces where people across different classes can engage on equal footing.
100%. White privilege refers to societal privilege that benefits white people over non-white people, particularly if they are otherwise under the same social, political, or economic circumstance. It refers to the implicit or systemic advantages that white people have relative to people of color. It is the absence of suspicion and negative reactions that people of color experience within racism. White privilege does not mean that you are inherently wealthy or without suffering. It also doesn't mean that you are a bad person. It means that all your struggles or challenges are not related to the color of your skin. This leads me to educational institutions such as integrated schools. Brackenfell High School learners have opened up on the experiences of blatant racism and microaggressions from other learners and teachers. I can't speak from experience, but how would that affect a child?
So we have an incredible amount of research that exists about the mental health impact of racism, sexism, so any form of discrimination. So social scientists talk about things like microaggressions as a form of social rejection. And what we know from the research is, so obviously we know human beings are social beings. We love connection. We want to be part of a group because that's just how we're designed. when we experience exclusion, our brains do not know how to process exclusion other than processing exclusion as a physical injury. So even though you know
Mm.
that there's a difference between me pouring a hot cup of coffee on you, which would have a very physical impact, versus me making fun of you because of the size of your nose or the afro that you have, even though you know
Mm.
there's a difference between the two things, our brains process that in exactly the same way. And so you can imagine what years and years and years of your brain processing um, uh, a disrespectful joke about your hair or racism or whatever it is, any form of microaggression. You can imagine the impact of your brain processing that as a physical trauma over
Mm.
a number of years. So we know that part of the consequence of things like racism, sexism, homophobia, especially on children, is the experiences of anxiety and oftentimes debilitating anxiety, the impact it has on your self confidence, the way you see yourself in relation to others, the impact it has on your own ability to stand up for yourself, right? So, as a child, because children often aren't able to differentiate between the things that are wrong with the world and the things that are wrong with them, children are really good at internalizing problems from the outside. And so especially if you're young and a child of color, you start to think you are the problem, and you start to think something is wrong with you. So there are ways in which that even creates what researchers talk about as self-loathing or self-hatred.
Mm.
Look, there's just no version of the story where any of these experiences are good for kids. And I've been hearing this weird narrative about how, oh, well, at least you build resilience, you become stronger. And I'm like, no, I'm sorry. There are different ways
Oh.
in which you can still build resilience without, treating me like a rubbish bag every day, right? So if you want to
Mm.
teach kids resilience, then I don't know, flip and do that via tennis or something, then maybe I lose a few tennis matches and then I feel bad, but then I understand it's a sport and I keep practicing until I start winning more tennis matches. I can still build resilience through that. I can still build resilience by struggling with something academically or struggling with something, a difficult question or a difficult project, and I learn and I push through and I grapple with difficult ideas. There's so many ways to build resilience, and it doesn't have to be through that type of suffering, at least not for children. I think for me, that's part of
Mm.
where I draw the line. It's different if, as an adult, I'm experiencing really tough life experiences that then build me into the person that I am. But there's something very dangerous about glorifying the strength that builds in children. And this is where the narrative about Black people being superhuman, is further reinforced. That, Black and brown kids, they can take it, they are stronger. And they can just
Mm.
take it, and they can just take whatever comes at them, and that's all part of the dehumanization of Black and brown people. So I think the impact on kids is quite severe. And with some of my experience in schools, it's very clear how these are not experiences that suddenly leave when you finish matric. These are experiences
Mm.
that you carry right through your whole life, because they're formative experiences. The things that happen to you in childhood are the things that shape who you become. And so these formative experiences have a huge impact. And obviously by the time you hit adulthood, it then becomes that there are just so many things about yourself, your family, your culture, your history, that you only learn to appreciate much later on, because of how it might have been denigrated when you were in school, and that's not healthy or helpful either.
How can we stop this from happening? How can we stop children from experiencing this trauma? What change needs to be implemented in schools to allow for equal opportunity
Mm,
and treatment of their
mm.
students?
Yeah. So I think part of it is also recognizing that schools are, whatever is happening in schools is a reflection of what's happening in our society. So I would also be hesitant to put such a blame on schools, or, I mean, I think we can give them responsibility, but I think it's important to name
Mm.
that whatever is happening in schools is happening in
At
homes.
home.
It's
Mm.
happening in our society. It's happening on TV. It's happening in corporate South Africa. It's happening in churches. It's happening in religious spaces. So if we want to really be honest about what's happening in schools, we have to look at all the other pockets that make up our society. So for me, that's the first part. But the second part is also that part of it is when, by the time kids get to school, there's so much work that families need to do in terms of preparing their children for school, preparing their children to exist in a society with so many other people. So on the one hand, I think many parents of color are having to make very serious trade-offs between the quality of education their child will get versus the preparation for the kind of prejudice and bias that their kids will experience. And we know this again. Sociologists have found that, Black parents, parents of color, tend to spend a lot more time preparing their kids for bias than white parents do, because white parents don't have to worry about that to a large extent because of the history of segregated schooling in our country. So there are trade-offs that families are making that other families don't even know that are being made. I think white parents are failing us a lot. White parents do not engage in sufficient racial literacy education for their own kids. So there's a way in which white adults in South Africa are sort of blissfully ignorant about the history of this country, or even if they're aware of the history, often then absolve themselves of any responsibility in that history, and so don't take accountability for the learning that their kids need to have. So there's a way in which white parents have work to do. And then obviously I think schools need to be a lot more honest. If you visit ex-Model C schools and public and private schools in this country, you almost get the sense that there's no Black teachers in South Africa. Like Black people don't study teaching, So there's a way in which you go to these schools and you only see white people and white teachers in positions of authority, which is great. I'm happy for white people to be teachers and in positions of authority. But if that's the only messaging we're giving children, then we're just further perpetuating this internalization of superiority in white kids and an internalization of inferiority in children of color. So I think our schools need to start doing better in terms of representation. I keep saying representation is not a nice to have. It is absolutely critical to a child's development of self, to a child's sense making of the world. If a child grows up in a world where they've got very monotone representations across different strata and levels in society, children internalize those patterns as natural. And children think, oh, these are just rules in society. This is just how it is. And so they start to see that it is natural that Black people are always subservient to white people. It is natural that white people are always in charge. It is natural that men are always in charge. And it's only until much later when they start to see different perspectives that they have to interrupt that for themselves. And we know that interrupting neural patterns that have been established at such a young age are really, really difficult to do. It's not a nice to have. We're actually creating warped human beings if we keep sending our kids to these types of schools. So schools need to do better in terms of representation, both in who is in authority, but also in what is being taught. If you are in a South African school today, you will probably think that Black people have done nothing in history and that colonialism was a blessing and that, it was a favor being done to us. Unless you are a very inquisitive student yourself, and unless you go slightly deeper and further in your history curriculum or your English curriculum, you will really just think that Black people were sitting twiddling their thumbs in Africa until white people came to save us. And so, part of what we're teaching in schools is really problematic. And kids themselves have identified this for me when I run sessions in schools is, the only representation they get of Black people is Black people were either always fighting each other. So we were perpetually in tribal wars amongst ourselves, or we were being raided and defeated by the Europeans. There's no part in our education where we're teaching kids about the contributions of Africans to history. But more generally, actually, it's not just about creating this African superiority complex. For me, it's also just helping kids to realize that there is knowledge from the global South that is incredibly valuable and was incredibly critical to shaping the modern world. And the messaging we give kids is that, the Europe, the global North, America, they made the most contributions to history, and the representation of that is often just, white people and white men. And that's not
Mm.
helpful. That's not helpful to kids of any race, right? So I think it's important for white children to have black role models, to have black female role models. I think it's so critical for white kids to have, black role models in their lives who aren't just the gardener, who aren't just their domestic worker, who aren't just the ground staff at their schools, right? And it's
Mm.
important for black kids to see themselves as well in a positive light, in history, but also in the present. So there's a lot at a curriculum transformation level that is just actually shameful for me, for a country like South Africa, given our history, given where we're coming from. And it says to me that actually we're quite comfortable with the status quo and we want to keep reproducing that. So there's lots of work to be done within the schools arena. And then also schools need to start seeing themselves as sites of justice. Many of our schools aren't being honest about their history, aren't being honest about how it came to be that this X school became such a wealthy school in such a nice suburb with such great grounds and so many acres of land, etc., etc. Many of our schools are dishonest about their own history, and as a result, aren't able or willing to enter the conversations that say, well, actually, if the wealth we have was unjustly amassed, what does it mean for us to be practicing restitution in post-apartheid South Africa? So it's also that schools need to also be active in taking responsibility for the history of this country. This country didn't become what it was by accident. It was by design. And schools were
Mm.
critical to that. So our schools need to also start, taking a lot more responsibility and making the tough calls and making the tough choices about how they want to be and who they want to be, and what that requires of them in terms of action. So yeah, those are some of the things for me that are quite important.
I asked a friend what she, as a person of color, would like to ask you, and she said the following: being mindful of the rigidness of systems, it can be quite discouraging for others to continue pushing for change and creating a much more inclusive and humanizing space. Having been in a position as SU or Stellenbosch University, what would your advice be to the students who are there now, feeling discouraged and exhausted to fight for a more inclusive space? And what role do you think students and individuals who have been in these spaces for a long period of time should play to improve the experience of these spaces?
Yeah, so in hindsight, for me, I think that I do think Black and Brown students must protect their peace. I think we place too much pressure or expectation that they must be the ones to fight for and fix their institutions, etc. And obviously, so from a moral perspective, absolutely, like, pick your battle, fight it, and be committed to change. But I actually think that people really underestimate how much these kinds of battles cost students,
Mm.
especially students, Black and Brown students. So for me, my first thing is protect your peace, and sometimes protecting your peace means you put your head down, get your degree, and you leave the institution, because the battles you're going to fight are not battles that are cheap, and often it will come at the expense of your own academic progress, your mental health, etc. And so for me, actually, I would lay that gauntlet down at the feet of white students. I think that white students take a lot for granted in terms of their experiences of education in this country in general, but specifically at institutions of higher learning. And so I think part of it is actually also for white students to take a lot more accountability and to be more vocal. I mean, what it costs for them to speak up and to challenge is not by any means close to what it costs a Black student to be the rebel rouser again, to be that student who's always moaning about
Mm.
something. And so I think part of it is also that white students need to start defining for themselves what is their moral duty, and not doing it as a favor. I think there's a moral duty on white people in this country in general to rectify the harms that have been done in their name, and for their benefit. So I think white students need to do better. And look, I think we're seeing that already in quite a lot of our campuses, where a lot of white students themselves might be becoming quite involved in some of these campaigns and some of these movements, which is great. And a part of it for me is also being intentional about how you repurpose your privilege, as well as how you channel your privilege in such a way that maybe creates more space, creates more voice, creates more platform, for Black students, as opposed to also taking over the conversation.
And in your line of work, have you encountered or been confronted by white guilt? How did you navigate it? And what advice would you give to Black and brown people if they ever find themselves confronted by white guilt?
Yeah, so the white guilt is the white guilt is a complex one. So yeah, I mean, here's the thing. I think that so I don't think it's any Black person's responsibility ever to help a white person navigate their guilt. So I don't think anybody must ever feel that they are obligated to navigate through that. At the same time, I do have a soft spot. Well, maybe a soft spot sounds wrong, but I have grace. No, I have grace. I have grace for white people who are navigating guilt and navigating shame, and especially for white children. So when I'm working in schools with white children, I do have a lot of grace for the things that they might be grappling with, because they're almost they're born into that guilt, they're born into that shame, and often their parents themselves do not have the vocabulary or the lexicon to help them navigate that and make sense of that. So I really do have grace for that. And in many ways, I think that there is something human about that. So I find that white people tend to try and rush through their guilt and rush through their shame and, try to fix it and do something about it, and or try to completely ignore it and say, well, I don't feel guilty, I didn't do anything. So you almost get those two extremes. And I think actually there's something very human about experiencing guilt. I think there's something very human about knowing that some form of harm was done to other humans for you without you actually having that much of a choice in it, right? So maybe not so much for the older generation, but maybe definitely for the younger generation. I mean, I think the older generation voted, so I'm not going to let them off the hook on that one. But I think especially for the younger generation, that this thing was done for us, for me, in my name, and I didn't even have a choice in it. And it has been done at the expense of fellow human beings. So I think that there's actually a gift for white people to sit in the discomfort of that guilt, because I think it also helps them to build that to build their humanity, but also to almost reassess their capacity for empathy, and to really expand their own muscle and their own resilience, for re-engaging the parts of their humanity that was lost or numbed by systems like racism. So that's the first thing for me. I think white people must sit in it for a little bit, and not sit in it from not a self-flagellating, not a paralyzing sitting in it, as in sitting in the discomfort of, sure, this really horrible thing has happened. What is the role that I want to see myself playing in making it slightly better for the human being next to me? That's what I mean by the sitting in it. And so I really love the work of Brene Brown here. I'm a huge Brene Brown fan. And Brene Brown differentiates between guilt and shame. So guilt being I might have done something bad, versus shame being I am bad. So I think shame is not a helpful emotion. It's a really useless emotion. Shame disrupts human connection. Shame also makes it all about you. So it centers you. Shame is it's an emotion that then keeps things hidden. Shame doesn't allow us to name things. Shame is disempowering, and shame makes us the victim. Yeah. So for me, when it comes
Mm.
to white people and shame, my recommendation is move through that thing very quickly. Don't stay in shame. But guilt for me is only useful as an emotion when it prompts you into action. So if I have done something wrong to you, or I know that someone in my family has done something wrong to you, I should feel guilty about it because that is human, right? That sense that at a metaphysical level, every human being is connected to every other human being. We are connected. And so when I know that something harmful has been done to you, I should feel bad. And I should feel some level of responsibility, if not for anything else other than just because we are both human. But my guilt is useless if it
Mm.
doesn't translate into action. And I think this is where white people often get stuck because I think a lot of white people think that their action needs to be some huge, like seismic shift in action, like you must fix the last 500 years and then we'll know that you've really, done your part. And I think that that's where people get stuck and get overwhelmed because the perception is it's this big thing I must do. And the other piece, which I've heard from a lot of the white people that I coach, is the sense of, but it's so big and it's never going to end, right? So there's nothing I can do as a white person to ever undo the white privilege. Like I walk into a room and my whiteness is activated in my favor. So there's the overwhelmedness and there's the sense that it's a forever thing. So my encouragement there is actually just start small, right? So the first thing is I think white people as individuals need to start building an anti-racism practice for themselves, right? So in the same way
Mm.
that racism is a learned behavior and racism is something that all white people in this country have been socialized into, whether they actively choose it or not, but being raised in a society where you're getting messages about superiority is socializing you into racism. And so for me, part of it is just starting with what is my anti racism practice? How am I going to unsocialize myself out of this? How am I going to take myself out of this? How am I going to unlearn? And sometimes that might mean obviously the reading, the educating myself, the awareness, because once you've got awareness, once you've seen something, you can't unsee it. So you start to be more vocal, right? Speaking out,
Mm.
challenging, at the family braai when Umsani Ferreira says something he's not supposed to say,
Mm.
you're confident enough to challenge and say, sorry, we're not allowed to say that anymore, and this is why what you're
Mm.
saying is uncomfortable for me. So it's the small ways in which you challenge in those moments. Sometimes it's the, okay, I've read up so much about institutional racism in this country. Actually, the contribution I can make is a financial contribution to such and such an institution. Or maybe it's
Mm.
sitting in a boardroom at work and you see how your black colleagues are constantly dismissed when they say something, but when Brad says something, oh, it's the best idea we've ever heard. So then it's naming that in the office and saying, guys, I'm really uncomfortable. Lovelyn just made that same point, but we're crediting it to
Mm.
Brad, right? So actually the systems of oppression that look so big are made up of lots of small little pieces. And the work for white people is actually working on those small little pieces with consistency. So often where we see
Mm.
white people taking action is the George Floyd, the Black Lives Matter, the Collins Causa. It's once a year, something big happens, then all the white people are posting on Facebook. That's not enough, right? Actually, what we
No,
need is
that's
this.
performative.
Yes, what we need is for white people to actually be that consistent as white people are about the rhinos, as consistent as white people are about the environment. We need that same level of consistency when it comes to the lives of black people and brown people in this country. So it can't just be
Mm.
the once off. And that's why I talk about anti racism as a practice. It is not a once off, it is a practice. And it's not a practice of 5,000 acts of do gooding. It's actually about embedding this daily in your life. So it might also require that white people change where they shop, right? So you don't just prop up big capitalist institutions only, but actually start to look at local community ventures. You start to look at
Mm.
that jeweler that is, owned by a small family that makes jewelry, or the florist around the corner from you, right? So it's actually also putting our money where our mouth is and using our resources in that way, right? So for me, it's just being very intentional about the daily small acts as opposed to that one big act that you do every year. So that would be sort of some of the things that I offer. And then maybe lastly, part of it is also that white people need to think very intentionally about what it might mean to build a healthy white racial identity. So I also don't think that the solution here is for white people to develop now their sense of, say, self-hatred, right? Like, okay, well, let's just replace black inferiority with white inferiority. I don't think that's the solution. I think part of it is that there's work, and Steve Biko refers to this in his essays, and I write what I like. He talks about the work that white people need to do amongst each other, right? So a lot of the times white people want to assuage their guilt by doing lots of stuff for black people and brown people, which is great as long as you do that in dignified ways. So don't just go take pictures of hungry children somewhere in Africa and then give them food and say, oh, I've done my part. But I think that
Mm.
there's work that white people must do amongst each other. The work that white people need to do in terms of building, asking questions about what is our culture as white people? What is the things we have brought here? What are the things we have done? And how can we start to reshape and reframe our culture? Culture is fluid. Culture can change over time. And in many ways, white people haven't done the work to interrogate their own culture, and as a result navigate society in quite dishonest ways about what that culture is, and also consequently ignore the potential of what that culture could become, in ways that are dignified and contribute meaningfully to a holistic humanity. So yeah.
No, that's very very good insights. It's something I haven't even thought about.
Mm.
You've managed to turn your activism into a sustainable career. How can other activists develop their activism into something that can sustain them financially, allowing them to continue with their work and contribution to their communities?
So, that's a really hard question. I think for me it was that I needed to do, I did a stint in corporate and really just, yeah, I mean, it was great, but I also didn't enjoy there was something about it that felt meaningless. There was something about it that felt inflexible. And so part of it for me was saying, actually, let me translate the things that are meaningful to me into action in a way that I can both own my time, but also do work that I care about. I don't think that everybody would want to go this route. Um, it's one thing to be an activist, and I think that there is a lot of, like, activists are critical to the formation of our society. But it's also another thing to translate what you are activisting about into action. And I think the truth is that everybody must find find your corner. Yeah, I think everyone has a part to play, but you've got to just be honest with yourself about what that part is that you need to play. So, in many of our communities, it's also just around being organized. Like, someone must be the activist, someone must be protesting, petitioning, writing to government, doing the media interviews, but also we need people who are implementers and can, make things happen. So yeah, it's a tough question to answer, but I think it's that you've also got to check in with yourself about what you are mentally, emotionally, spiritually willing to handle, but also at the same time, what are the ways in which you can collaborate with different people at different points in the journey, so that you also don't take everything on yourself. Yeah, I hope that makes sense. It's such a tough question, but yeah, I think everyone needs to find what they are at peace about, and what in your heart you feel is really true to the person that you are.
Yes,
Yeah.
live intentionally and living with your intuition
Yes,
and your
yes,
inner voice.
yes,
Yeah,
exactly.
100%.
Yeah.
But thank you so much for your time, Lovelyn. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me, Marissa. I really appreciate it as well.
Thank you for joining us today. If this conversation made you feel uncomfortable, that's okay. It's important to sit in this discomfort. If your impulse is to contact or reach out to a person of color, stop. Placing the burden of offering comfort and education on Black and brown people has a very real psychological impact. It is not the responsibility of people of color to educate you whilst reliving their own trauma. There are thousands of resources available to you. Do the work, become an ally, practice anti-racism, and stay consistent. I have included a few resources in the description to get you started. And that's a wrap. Thank you so much for tuning in to today's episode, and be sure to subscribe to this podcast to avoid missing out on any future episodes. I'd appreciate it if you could leave a review, and if you have any thoughts on today's episode or perhaps topics you would like me to touch on, you can contact me via email. A link is provided in the description. I hope today's episode provided some new insights to what it means to be human. And I hope to see you in the next one.